He was disgusted by his fat daughter, so he gave her away to a Hell's Angel like she was nothing more than a burden. Everyone thought it was the end of her story. But what happened next shocked the entire town. The biker, covered in tattoos, feared by everyone, didn't take her for revenge or money. He took her to save her. In his broken trailer at the edge of nowhere, she found something she'd never known before: kindness, safety, and faith. But just when she began to believe she was finally free, her father came back, with lies, police, and the power to destroy everything. As the world called her ugly, worthless, and unlovable, she began to rise into something no one saw coming: a light strong enough to heal even the man who broke her. What happens when the one everyone called fat and useless becomes the only one who can save them all? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun beat down on the cracked pavement of Willow Creek's main street, where the faded sign of Morrison's grocery store cast long shadows across the nearly empty parking lot. 16-year-old Mara Dalton stood at the entrance, clutching her mother's old envelope like a lifeline. The paper was worn soft at the edges from years of being hidden away in the back of her sock drawer. Inside the store, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mara carefully made her way through the aisles. She kept her eyes down, trying to make herself as invisible as possible despite her size. The linoleum floors squeaked beneath her feet as she selected the bare essentials: a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, and some cheese. Each item went into her basket with careful consideration of the precious few dollars she had. The envelope contained $20, the last gift from her mother before she'd left 3 years ago. Mara had been saving it for emergencies, and with the empty kitchen cabinets at home, this qualified as one. At the checkout counter, Mrs. Peterson, the elderly cashier, gave her a gentle smile. "Hello, dear. Found everything you needed today?" Mara nodded, managing a small smile in return. She'd always liked Mrs. Peterson, who never looked at her with the usual mixture of pity and judgment she got from most people in town. The bell above the store's entrance chimed, but Mara didn't turn around. She was too focused on counting out the wrinkled bills from the envelope with trembling fingers. "Well, would you look at that?" A harsh voice cut through the quiet store like broken glass. "If it ain't my daughter, spending money that ain't hers." Mara's heart sank as the heavy footsteps of her father approached. The smell of whiskey reached her before he did, and she could feel her shoulders hunching instinctively. Rick Dalton stumbled to a stop beside her, his eyes bloodshot and his shirt stained. He grabbed the envelope from her hands, making her flinch. "Where'd you get this money, girl?" I've been saving it," Mara whispered, her voice barely audible. Rick let out a bitter laugh that echoed through the store. Other customers had stopped their shopping to watch the scene unfold. "Saving it? For what? More food?" He gestured at her body with disgust. "Lord knows you don't need any more of that." Mrs. Peterson tried to intervene. "Now, Rick, there's no need for—" "Stay out of this," Rick snapped, then turned back to Mara. "Look at you, standing here like some beggar. You're just like your mother, sneaking around, hiding things." He crumpled the envelope in his fist. "A disgrace is what you are. Nothing but a waste of good food." Tears welled up in Mara's eyes as she felt the stares of everyone in the store. A young mother pulled her children closer. An elderly man shook his head. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow harsher, highlighting every inch of her that her father found wanting. "I'm sorry," Mara whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for, being hungry, being there, or simply existing. "Sorry?" Rick's voice grew louder. Sorry don't feed us, does it? Sorry don't pay the bills that keep piling up while you sit around getting fatter by the day? The tears spilled over then, and Mara couldn't bear it anymore. She turned and fled, leaving her groceries on the counter. The automatic doors barely opened in time as she burst through them into the humid Montana afternoon. The parking lot wavered through her tears as she ran, her footsteps echoing off the surrounding buildings. Behind her, she could hear her father's voice carrying through the open door. Yeah, run away, just like your mother. Hours later, the small kitchen in their worn-down house was filled with tension thick enough to cut. Rick sat at the table, a bottle of whiskey his only companion as Mara moved silently around him, clearing away the remnants of their meager dinner. The plates clinked softly in the sink as she washed them, trying to make herself as quiet as possible. The phone's sharp ring cut through the silence, making her jump. Rick stumbled to his feet, grabbing the receiver from its wall mount. Mara kept her head down, but her ears strained to hear the conversation. Yeah. Rick's voice was slurred but angry. I told you I'd have it. No, you listen here. There was a long pause, and Mara could feel her father's eyes boring into her back. I'll pay the debt one way or another, even if I have to give you the fat one. The words hit Mara like a physical blow. The plate she was washing slipped from her trembling fingers, making a soft splash in the soapy water. She kept her back turned, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, as her father's words echoed in her mind, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. Morning crept into Willow Creek like a hesitant visitor. The sun barely peeked over the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the gravel road where wisps of mist curled and danced in the crisp Montana air. Mara lay in her narrow bed, eyes fixed on the water-stained ceiling of their trailer. She hadn't really slept. Her father's words from the night before kept echoing in her mind. Even if I have to give you the fat one. The ancient springs of her mattress creaked as she pushed herself up. Her movements were careful, practiced in the art of staying quiet. The floor beneath her feet was cold, and a draft whistled through the poorly sealed window. Outside, birds were beginning their morning songs, but the sound brought her no comfort today. In the kitchen, Mara moved like a ghost, pulling out pans with practiced care to avoid any clattering. The routine was familiar. Eggs from their nearly empty refrigerator, the last few slices of bread. Her hands trembled slightly as she cracked the eggs into the pan, watching the whites spread and bubble. Through the window she could see the morning mist still clinging to the ground, making their yard look almost peaceful. The old pickup truck sat rusting in the patchy grass, and beyond it, the gravel road stretched away toward town. The silence felt heavy, weighted with yesterday's shame and last night's threatening words. The eggs were just beginning to firm up when she heard it, the distant rumble of engines. Not cars, but something deeper, more threatening. Motorcycles. The sound grew louder, echoing off the surrounding hills, and Mara's heart began to race. She turned the burner off with shaking hands, leaving breakfast half-cooked. The rumbling grew to a roar, and then multiple bikes appeared through the morning mist, their chrome glinting in the early light. They pulled up in front of the trailer, engines idling with a menacing purr. Mara counted 5 of them, their riders massive figures in leather and denim. The door to her father's room banged open. Rick Dalton emerged, surprisingly steady on his feet despite last night's drinking. He wore the same clothes as yesterday, his face set in a hard mask as he stepped out onto their small porch. The leader of the bikers dismounted first. He was enormous, taller than Mara's father by at least a head, with broad shoulders and arms covered in tattoos that disappeared into his leather vest. His face was weathered, with a strong jaw partially hidden by a neatly trimmed beard. But it was his eyes that caught Mara's attention. They were calm, almost gentle, despite his intimidating appearance. "Rick," the man said, his voice deep and gravelly, "you know why we're here." Her father spat to the side. "Jesse Cade, didn't expect you to show up yourself. Thought you'd send your dogs to do your dirty work." "Some things need handling personal," Jesse replied. He glanced at the trailer, and for a moment his eyes met Mara's through the window. She stepped back quickly, but not before seeing something in his gaze. Not the hardness she expected, but something else. Something that looked almost like concern. "The money, Rick," Jesse continued. "You've had more than enough time." Rick laughed, but it was an ugly sound. "Time? What about all the time I gave your brother in that sandbox overseas, before he got himself killed doing something stupid?" The other bikers tensed, hands tightening on handlebars, but Jesse held up one hand, keeping them in place. "That's got nothing to do with this. You borrowed money. You made promises. Now it's time to pay." Mara couldn't help herself. She moved closer to the door, drawn by the tension in the air. Her father's shoulders were tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Then, suddenly, his posture changed. He relaxed, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "You want payment?" Rick turned and pointed at Mara, who stood frozen in the doorway. "Take her. She eats enough to pay my debt." The words hung in the morning air like poison. Mara felt her whole body go cold, then hot with shame. Tears pricked at her eyes as she waited for the laughter, the cruel jokes, the disgusted looks she was so used to receiving. But none came. Instead, Jesse Cade looked at her with those calm eyes, and in them she saw something she hadn't expected. Sorrow, understanding, and a deep, quiet anger that wasn't directed at her. The big man studied her for a long moment, then turned back to her father. "Fine," Jesse said, his voice quiet but firm, "but she rides with me by choice." Rick snorted. "Choice? She ain't got no choice. She's my daughter, and I'm telling her to go." But Jesse ignored him, keeping his eyes on Mara. He took a step toward the porch, his movement slow and careful, like approaching a frightened animal. "It's your decision," he said softly. "No one's forcing you. But if you want to leave, I'll make sure you're safe." Mara looked at her father, the man who had hurt her with words and neglect for so long. She looked at the half-cooked breakfast on the stove, at the shabby trailer that had been her prison. Then she looked at Jesse Cade, with his gentle eyes and massive frame, offering her something she'd never had before. A choice. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she took a step forward. "Anywhere but here," she whispered. Jesse nodded once, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a spare helmet. He held it out to her, and Mara took it with trembling hands. Behind her she could hear her father's sneering laugh, but it seemed distant now, less powerful than before. The helmet was heavy in her hands, its black surface reflecting the morning sun. Jesse led her to his motorcycle, showing her where to put her feet, how to hold on. The engine rumbled beneath her, powerful and somehow reassuring. As she wrapped her arms around Jesse's solid frame, she could feel the vibrations of the bike through her whole body. The wind whipped past as they pulled away, the other bikes falling in behind them. Mara didn't look back at the trailer or her father. She didn't need to. Instead, she watched the morning mist part before them as they rode away, her old life disappearing into the distance with each turn of the wheels. The motorcycle convoy wound through back roads until they reached the outskirts of town, where tall pines stretched toward the sky like silent guardians. Jesse's home came into view, a weathered silver trailer set back from the road, surrounded by a neat yard dotted with cheerful wildflowers and well-worn paths. As they pulled up, 3 dogs bounded towards them, a golden retriever with graying muzzle, a spotted blue heeler, and a scraggly black mutt. Their tails wagged furiously as Jessie cut the engine. The air carried the familiar scents of pine needles and motor oil from the small garage workshop nearby. "Home sweet home," Jessie said, helping Mara off the bike. Her legs felt wobbly after the long ride. "Don't worry about the dogs. They're all bark and no bite." The golden retriever approached Mara cautiously, sniffing her hand before giving it a gentle lick. Despite everything, she felt a small smile tug at her lips. "That's Grace," Jessie said, watching the interaction. "She's got a way of knowing who needs a friend." The other bikers had already departed, leaving them alone in the golden afternoon light. Jessie led Mara up the wooden steps to his front door, the boards creaking softly beneath their feet. The screen door squeaked as he held it open for her. Inside, the trailer was modest but immaculately clean. The living room held a worn leather armchair, a simple couch with carefully arranged pillows, and bookshelves lined with well-used Bibles and other books. What caught Mara's eye were the photographs, dozens of them, covering nearly every wall. Young faces smiled out from simple frames, teenagers with tough expressions that couldn't quite hide their hope, children beaming proudly, groups gathered around holiday tables. "Who are they?" Mara asked softly, drawn to a photo of a girl about her age, arms wrapped around Grace the retriever. "Kids who needed somewhere safe to land for a while," Jessie replied, his voice gentle. "Some were runaways, some had nowhere else to go, some just needed to know somebody cared." Mara noticed something else, scripture verses written in careful handwriting, framed alongside the photos. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." The words seemed to speak directly to her heart, though she barely understood why. Jessie cleared his throat. "Listen, Mara. We need to talk about something important." He gestured to the couch, and she sat, trying to make herself small despite her size. He took the armchair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I want you to know something right off. I don't want anything from you. Not money, not work, nothing." His eyes held hers steadily. "All I ask for is honesty. Can you do that?" Mara nodded, throat tight with unexpected emotion. "Good. Now, let me show you your room." He led her down a short hallway to a small but tidy bedroom. A twin bed with fresh sheets sat beneath a window that looked out on the pine forest. A simple wooden dresser held an old radio, and a full-length mirror hung on the back of the door. It wasn't much, but to Mara, it felt like luxury compared to her old room. "Bathroom's across the hall," Jessie said. "Take your time getting settled. I'll start dinner." Left alone, Mara sat on the bed, running her hand over the clean sheets. They smelled of sunshine and fabric softener. The mirror caught her reflection, a scared, overweight girl with red-rimmed eyes. But somehow, in this space, the sight didn't sting quite as much as usual. The sound of pots clanking in the kitchen drew her out eventually. She found Jessie at the stove, making grilled cheese sandwiches while a pot of tomato soup simmered nearby. The domestic scene seemed at odds with his intimidating appearance, tattoos visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves as he carefully flipped a sandwich. "Hope this is okay," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "It's not fancy, but it's filling." When everything was ready, Jessie carried their plates to a small kitchen table by a window. But before picking up his sandwich, he did something that made Mara's heart catch. He bowed his head. "Lord," he said quietly, "thank you for this food and for bringing Mara safely here. Guide us both in the days ahead. Amen." The simple prayer brought unexpected tears to Mara's eyes. She couldn't remember the last time she'd heard anyone pray, probably not since her mother left years ago. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the pine trees gold. Later that night, lying in her new bed, Mara found sleep elusive despite her exhaustion. The house creaked and settled around her, but underneath those sounds, she heard Jesse's voice, low and serious, from somewhere down the hall. "I don't know what God wants me to do with this girl," she heard him say, presumably on the phone. "But I'll protect her. Yes, Pastor Mike, I understand the responsibility. No, she's safe here. I've helped other kids before, but this feels different somehow." Mara rolled over, pressing her face into the pillow as tears came once again. But these tears felt different from the ones she was used to, the ones born of shame and fear and hopelessness. These tears came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that recognized what it felt like to be truly safe for the first time in years. The dogs barked softly outside her window, and through the wall, she could still hear the quiet rumble of Jesse's voice as he continued his conversation. Mara pulled the clean sheets up to her chin, breathing in their fresh scent. In this moment, in this simple room with its radio and mirror and window full of stars, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel in a very long time. Peace. The Montana summer days flowed like honey, slow and sweet. Each morning, Mara woke to the sound of dogs barking and Jesse's deep voice calling them for breakfast. At first, she stayed in her room until called, but gradually she began joining him earlier and earlier. "These dogs," Jesse explained one morning, leading her to the kennels behind the trailer. "They're like us, looking for a second chance." He showed her how to fill water bowls and measure food, his big hands gentle as he demonstrated. "Each one has a story. Like Max here," he patted a 3-legged German shepherd, found him tied up behind a gas station, and Luna, he pointed to a black lab mix. She was so scared of people she wouldn't come near anyone for weeks. Mara found herself drawn to a chubby golden retriever who waddled when she walked. "What's her story?" "That's Daisy. Previous owners overfed her thinking it was love. Sound familiar?" His eyes met hers with understanding, not judgment. "Sometimes the wounds we carry aren't visible, but they're just as real." In the kitchen, Jesse taught her about real food, not the microwave meals she'd grown up on. He showed her how to chop vegetables, measure ingredients, and trust her instincts. "Cooking," he'd say, "is about paying attention. Like life, you got to stay present." "But what if I mess up?" she'd ask, hesitating over the stove. "Then we learn and try again. Nobody gets it right the first time?" The lessons weren't just about food. Jesse taught her to stand straight instead of hunching to hide her size. "Head up," he'd remind her gently. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." One Sunday morning, Jesse suggested they visit his church. Mara's stomach clenched with anxiety, but something in his steady gaze gave her courage. The Willow Creek Church was small, with white clapboard sides and a crooked steeple. Inside, instead of the judgment she feared, she found warmth. The women of the congregation surrounded her like a soft blanket. Mrs. Baker, with her silver hair and flour-dusted apron, showed her how to make cinnamon rolls in the church kitchen. Miss Sarah, who taught 3rd grade, always had a funny story about her students, and elderly Mrs. Wilson, who'd lost her husband last year, simply held Mara's hand during difficult hymns. "You come sit by me, honey," they'd say, making space in their pews. They didn't stare at her size or ask uncomfortable questions. They just included her, naturally and completely. Laughter came back to her slowly, like a forgotten language. It started with small things, the way Jesse's oldest dog snored during prayers, or how Mrs. Baker always had powdered sugar in her eyebrows. Soon, Mara found herself smiling more often than not. One evening, as the Montana sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. They sat on Jesse's worn porch steps. The air smelled of pine needles and approaching autumn. Jesse was quiet for a long time, watching the clouds drift by. "I wasn't always like this," he finally said, his voice rough with memory. "Used to be the kind of man good folks crossed the street to avoid." Mara listened as he described his past, the violence, the addiction, the motorcycle gang that had been his family. His wife, beautiful and broken like him, who couldn't fight her demons and died of an overdose. "That was my rock bottom," he said, absently touching the cross tattooed on his forearm. "Lying on a jail cell floor, coming down hard, I finally heard God speaking to me. Wasn't a voice exactly, more like a feeling of love so strong it broke everything inside me. All the anger, all the hate, it just dissolved." He turned to look at Mara, his eyes intense. "If God could turn me around, me who had done every wrong thing possible, He can turn anyone around. That's why I help kids now. That's why I knew I had to help you." Mara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but for once she didn't try to hide them. That night, she started a notebook she kept hidden under her mattress. In it, she wrote down things she was grateful for: clean sheets, dog kisses, the smell of fresh bread, women who smile with their eyes, a man who shows what fathers should be. For 3 weeks, life settled into this new pattern of peace and possibility. Then came the evening when red and blue lights shattered their quiet world. They were cleaning up after dinner when they heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Through the window, Mara saw 2 police cars pulling up, their lights painting the pine trees in alternating crimson and sapphire. Her father's truck followed behind them. "No," she whispered, the word barely a breath. Rick Dalton emerged from his truck, pointing at the trailer. "That's where he's keeping her," he shouted, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "That's where he took my little girl." 4 officers approached the door. Jesse stood slowly, his calm facade cracking only slightly. "Mara," he said quietly, "remember what we talked about? Head up. Truth is your shield." The knock came, sharp and official. When Jesse opened the door, the officers already had their hands on their weapons. "Jesse Cade," one asked, though it wasn't really a question. "We have a warrant for your arrest on suspicion of kidnapping a minor." "No!" Mara pushed forward. "He didn't kidnap me. I chose to come. Dad, tell them the truth." But Rick was playing his role perfectly, the concerned father, voice breaking with false emotion. "It's okay, baby. You're safe now. This man can't hurt you anymore." "The only one who hurt me was you!" Mara screamed. But the officers were already moving past her, pulling Jesse's arms behind his back. The handcuffs clicked like thunder in Mara's ears. Jesse didn't resist, didn't argue. He just looked at her with those steady eyes that had taught her so much about strength. "Jesse!" she screamed as they led him away. "Jesse!" But he was already disappearing into the police car, and her father's hands were on her shoulders, and the dogs were barking, and the sun was setting blood red behind the pines, and everything good was shattering like glass. "Jesse!" Her voice broke on his name as the police cars pulled away, red and blue lights fading into the gathering dark. The familiar musty smell of her father's trailer hit Mara before she even opened her eyes. For a moment, she thought the past 3 weeks had been just a dream. The rescue dogs, Jesse's gentle guidance, the taste of hope. But the ache in her chest told her it had all been real. Sunlight filtered through the threadbare curtains, casting sickly yellow patterns on her worn bedspread. The walls seemed closer than before, the ceiling lower. Everything felt wrong, like a sweater that had shrunk in the wash. From the kitchen, she could hear Rick moving around, humming off-key. The sound made her stomach turn. She pulled the blanket over her head, trying to hold on to the memory of Jesse's peaceful trailer, the way the morning light had danced through the pine trees. "Rise and shine, princess," Rick's voice boomed from the doorway. She could smell the whiskey on his breath even from across the room. "Bet you're glad to be home, huh? Away from that criminal?" Mara stayed silent, curled tight beneath her blanket. "Hey, I'm talking to you." The edge in his voice was sharp enough to cut. "That biker trash is rotting in jail where he belongs, and you better get used to being back here because this is where you stay." She heard him stumble closer, felt the mattress dip as he sat heavily on its edge. "You know what they do to guys like him in prison? Guys who take other men's daughters?" He laughed, an ugly sound that made her flinch. "Bet he ain't so high and mighty now." Mara squeezed her eyes shut, remembering Jesse's words about holding her head high. But it was hard to feel strong when everything good had been stripped away. The days that followed blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Mara moved through them like a ghost, refusing to speak, barely eating. She'd sit at the kitchen table, pushing food around her plate while Rick alternated between mocking her and trying to pretend everything was normal. At night, she wrote letters to Jesse by flashlight, pouring her heart onto paper. "Dear Jesse, I miss the dogs. I miss your prayers before dinner. I miss feeling like I mattered. Dad says awful things about you, but I know the truth. You showed me what kindness looks like. Please don't forget about me." But each letter came back unopened, stamped with red ink. "Contact restricted by court order." She kept them all in a shoebox under her bed, along with the gratitude journal she'd started at Jesse's house. The bruises started small, a grip too tight on her arm when she wouldn't answer him, a shove into the doorframe when she walked past. Rick's frustration grew with each passing day of her silence. He'd never hit her before, not really, but something had changed. Maybe it was the way she looked at him now, with eyes that had seen what a real father could be. 2 weeks after Jesse's arrest, Mrs. Henderson from next door noticed the bruise on Mara's cheek as she took out the trash. The older woman's eyes lingered a bit too long, her lips pressed into a thin line of concern. 3 days later, a social worker named Ms. Patterson showed up at their door. She had kind eyes and a no-nonsense voice that even Rick couldn't intimidate. She asked Mara questions while Rick hovered nearby, his presence heavy as storm clouds. "Can you show me where you sleep?" Ms. Patterson asked, her pen poised over a notepad. Mara led her to the tiny bedroom, watching as the social worker took in the water stains on the ceiling, the broken window latch, the empty liquor bottles poorly hidden under Rick's bed. "Pack a bag," Ms. Patterson said quietly. "Just the essentials." Rick's protests echoed through the trailer park as Mara was led to a government-issued car. He alternated between threats and pleading, but Ms. Patterson didn't flinch. "We'll be in touch about your court date, Mr. Dalton," was all she said. The youth shelter was a concrete building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Inside, everything was beige and gray. The walls, the floors, the plastic chairs in the common room. It smelled of industrial cleaner and teenage despair. Ms. Patterson led her through a maze of corridors to a large room filled with bunk beds. Girls of various ages lounged on their assigned spots, some reading dog-eared magazines, others staring blankly at the ceiling. They all had the same look in their eyes, like animals who'd been kicked too many times. "This is your bed," Ms. Patterson said, pointing to an empty bottom bunk. "Dinner is at 6, lights out at 9:30. There's group therapy every morning at 10, and individual sessions twice a week." She handed Mara a stack of fresh linens. "I know it's not ideal, but you're safe here." Safe. The word felt hollow now. Safe was Jesse's trailer with its mismatched furniture and Bible verses on the walls. Safe was the sound of dog paws on wooden floors and the smell of fresh coffee in the morning. This place, with its institutional walls and broken girls, felt like just another kind of prison. That first night, Mara lay awake listening to the sounds of the shelter, girls crying in their sleep, the click of the guards' shoes in the hallway, the hum of fluorescent lights that never fully turned off. The girl in the bunk above her snored softly, occasionally muttering words Mara couldn't understand. She touched the cross necklace Jessie had given her, hidden beneath her shirt where the intake staff hadn't noticed it. In the darkness, she whispered the words he'd taught her, the ones that had become her lifeline. You are more than what they say. You are more than what they say. You are more than what they say. The words echoed in her mind, competing with the memory of her father's cruel laughter and the cold reality of her new surroundings. But she held on to them like a drowning person holds on to a life preserver, because they were all she had left of the man who'd shown her what love really looked like. The ceiling above her was dotted with water stains that looked like continents on a map. As she traced their shapes with her eyes, Mara whispered Jessie's words one more time, trying to believe them even here, even now. You are more than what they say. The morning after her first night at the shelter, Mara sat alone in the cafeteria, pushing bland scrambled eggs around her plate. A shadow fell across her table, and she looked up to see a girl about her age, thin as a rail with sharp green eyes and choppy brown hair. "You're in my spot," the girl said, but her tone held more amusement than threat. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't—" Mara started to rise, but the girl waved her back down. "Relax, I'm Casey, and I'm just messing with you." She dropped onto the bench across from Mara, stealing a piece of toast from her plate. "You're new. I can tell by the deer in headlights look." Mara managed a small smile. "That obvious, huh?" "Trust me, we all had it when we first got here." Casey leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Want the crash course on surviving this place?" Over the next hour, Casey showed Mara around the shelter, pointing out which staff members were cool and which ones to avoid. "Miss Jenny in the kitchen will give you extra portions if you help wash dishes. And whatever you do, don't get on Mrs. Wilcox's bad side. She runs the night shift like it's a military operation." As they walked the perimeter of the exercise yard, Casey shared her own story. She'd run away from home at 15 after years of neglect from her drug-addicted mother. "Spent 8 months on the streets before the cops picked me up," she said, kicking at loose gravel. "Been here almost a year now." "A year?" Mara's eyes widened. "Is that normal?" Casey shrugged. "Depends. Some girls are gone in a week. Others stick around until they age out. Me? I'm waiting for my 18th birthday. 4 more months, and I'm free." That afternoon, during mandatory quiet time, Mara found an old spiral notebook in the supply closet. She remembered how Jesse would write in his prayer journal each morning, and something pulled her to do the same. Her first entry was simple. "Dear God, I don't know if you're listening, but Jesse believed in you. Maybe that's enough for now." Days began to take on a rhythm. Every morning after breakfast, Mara would walk laps around the yard. At first, she could barely make it twice around without getting winded, her body heavy and uncooperative. But she kept at it, Casey often joining her, the two girls talking about everything and nothing. "My dad," Mara confided one morning, 3 weeks into her stay, "he used to say I was worthless because of my weight." Casey's face darkened. "Parents, man, they're supposed to love us, right? Instead, they're the ones who mess us up the most." In group therapy, Mara listened as other girls shared similar stories of rejection and pain. There was Tanya, whose stepfather had thrown her out for being gay. Maria, whose mother chose an abusive boyfriend over her own daughter. Each story was different, but the wound was the same. The people who should have loved them most had failed them completely. As weeks turned into months, small changes began to appear. The daily walks got easier. The shelter's simple but healthy meals, combined with her new exercise routine, started to show results. Her clothes grew looser, her face thinner. But more than that, her spirit began to lift. She found herself helping new girls adjust, remembering how lost she'd felt that first night. When 14-year-old Sophie arrived, trembling and tearful, Mara showed her where to find extra blankets and sat with her until she fell asleep. The staff noticed. Miss Jenny started asking Mara to help plan menus and teach other girls basic cooking skills. Mrs. Wilcox appointed her evening coordinator, trusting her to help younger girls with homework and maintain quiet hours. "You've got a gift," Casey told her one evening as they prepared dinner together. "You see people's hurt, and you actually give a damn." Mara thought of Jessie, how he'd seen past her size to the person underneath. "Someone did that for me once," she said softly. 3 months into her stay, the shelter's chaplain, Pastor David, approached her during free time. He carried a small book with a blue cover. "I've noticed you helping the other girls," he said, holding out the book. "Thought you might be interested in this. It's a Bible study about finding strength in difficult times." Mara took the book, running her fingers over its worn cover. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. That night, she started reading, remembering Jesse's quiet faith and how it had changed him from the inside out. The words spoke to something deep inside her, a hunger she hadn't known how to name. 5 months after arriving at the shelter, Mara stood in the bathroom after her shower, toweling her hair dry. The mirror, though spotted and slightly warped, showed a different person than the one who'd arrived that first night. Her face was thinner, yes, but it was more than that. Her eyes held steadiness now, a quiet confidence that came from somewhere deeper than appearance. She thought about Jesse's words, about being more than what others say. For the first time, she truly understood what he meant. Leaning closer to the mirror, she whispered to her reflection, "I see you now." The girl in the mirror smiled back, and Mara realized it wasn't just her body that had changed. It was her heart. The shame that had weighed her down for so long was finally beginning to lift, replaced by something lighter, something that felt a lot like hope. Jesse sat in the small holding cell, his weathered Bible open on his lap. The morning light filtered through a narrow window, casting shadows across the worn pages. He'd been here before, years ago, when he was a different man. But this time was different. This time, he was here for doing what was right. The door clanged open. "Court time, Cade," the guard announced. Jesse closed his Bible carefully, saying a silent prayer before standing. His church friend and lawyer, Tom Matthews, waited in the hallway, briefcase in hand. "Ready?" Tom asked, straightening his tie. Jesse nodded. "Truth's on our side. That's all we need." Meanwhile, at the youth shelter, Mara paced nervously in her room. Casey watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "You've got to testify," Casey said firmly. "Nobody else knows the whole truth like you do." Mara wrapped her arms around herself. What if I freeze up? What if I can't find the words?" Casey crossed the room and grabbed Mara's shoulders. "Listen to me. That man saved your life. Now it's your turn to save his." The courthouse loomed before them, all brick and stern dignity. Inside, Jesse sat calmly at the defense table while Rick Dalton glared from across the aisle. The prosecutor painted Jesse as a predator, twisting his past into something dark and dangerous. "This man," the prosecutor declared, "this former gang leader took a minor from her home. The evidence clearly shows—" "Objection," Tom interrupted. "The evidence shows nothing of the sort. We have witnesses who'll testify to Mr. Dalton's abuse of his daughter. Judge Raymond Keller, a man with steel-gray hair and keen eyes, leaned forward. Proceed with your witnesses, counselor. One by one, neighbors testified about Rick's drinking, his rages, the shouting they'd heard through thin trailer walls. The grocery store cashier described the public humiliation she'd witnessed. Jesse's pastor spoke of his transformation from violence to faith, his years of helping troubled youth. Then Jesse took the stand. He spoke quietly but firmly about that morning, about seeing the fear in Mara's eyes, about offering her safety, not taking her against her will. I've done wrong things in my life, Jesse admitted, meeting the judge's gaze. But helping that girl wasn't one of them. Rick's testimony came next, full of righteous anger and accusations. But something in his voice rang hollow, especially when he claimed to be a caring father concerned for his daughter's welfare. The courtroom doors opened quietly. Mara slipped in with Casey beside her, clutching her friend's hand. Her heart hammered as she watched her father lying on the stand. During a brief recess, Casey nudged Mara. Now's the time. You've got to speak up. Trembling, Mara approached Tom Matthews. I want to testify. The lawyer's eyes widened. Are you sure? It won't be easy. I'm sure. When court resumed, Mara took the stand. Her voice quivered at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. She told the truth, all of it, the years of verbal abuse, the shame, the fear, that final morning when her father had tried to trade her to pay a debt. Jesse didn't kidnap me, she said clearly. He saved me. He showed me what it means to be treated with respect, with kindness. Her eyes found Rick's, but he looked away. My father. He made me believe I was worthless. Jesse taught me that wasn't true. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Keller studied Mara's face for a long moment, then turned to Jesse. Mr. Cade, please rise. Jesse stood, his expression serene. Having heard all testimony, particularly that of Miss Dalton, I find no evidence of kidnapping or any other criminal act. All charges are hereby dismissed. Relief flooded through Mara. Without thinking, she ran from the witness stand straight to Jesse, throwing her arms around him. He hugged her gently, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Rick stormed out, slamming the courtroom door behind him. Outside, the afternoon sun painted the courthouse steps golden. Casey hugged Mara fiercely, then stepped back to give her space with Jesse. You were brave in there, Jesse said softly. Standing up for the truth like that. Mara wiped her eyes. I was so scared, but I kept thinking about what you taught me about faith being stronger than fear. Jesse placed his hands on her shoulders, his expression serious but gentle. Listen to me, Mara. What happened in there? That was God's truth coming to light. But remember this always. You don't belong to anyone but God. Not your father, not me, not anyone else. Remember that. Sunlight streamed through the small window of Mara's apartment, casting warm patches on the worn wooden floor. She stood at her tiny kitchen counter, carefully measuring coffee grounds into the filter. The aroma filled her modest home, a one-bedroom unit above Miller's hardware store, funded by the Willow Creek Community Scholarship Program. The space wasn't much, but it was hers. Cheerful yellow curtains, sewn by the church ladies, framed each window. A bookshelf held her growing collection of textbooks and devotionals. On the wall hung a mirror, not hidden away like in her old life, but placed where she could see herself clearly each morning. Mara glanced at her reflection now, still getting used to the changes. Her body had grown stronger from hours of lifting boxes at the food bank. Her face had softened, worry lines replaced by laugh lines. Even her eyes seemed different, clearer, more certain. The clock read 6:30 in the morning. She had 2 hours before her shift at the food bank, then night school classes later. Settling at her small table with her coffee, she opened her journal, a habit Jessie had encouraged that first summer. Today's entry began like all the others. Things I'm grateful for. Her pen moved steadily across the page. The scholarship that gave her this fresh start. The women at church who believed in her before she believed in herself. The girls at the food bank who trusted her with their stories. And Jessie, still checking in on her, still teaching her. About engines and faith and second chances. The phone rang, interrupting her morning ritual. It was Mrs. Henderson from the food bank. "Mara, honey, we've got 3 new families coming in today. Think you could come in early?" "Of course," Mara said, already reaching for her jacket. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The food bank occupied the basement of Willow Creek Church. What had once been a dreary space now buzzed with energy and purpose. Mara helped organize the shelves, making sure the healthiest options were easily accessible. She remembered how it felt to be hungry, to feel shame about needing help. Now she made sure every person who came through those doors felt welcomed and valued. Today's new arrival was a teenage girl, thin and nervous, clutching her paperwork like a shield. Mara recognized that look. She'd worn it herself not so long ago. "I'm Mara," she said gently. "Would you like some coffee while we get your items together?" The girl's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Yes, please. I'm Jenny." While they waited for the coffee to brew, Mara shared bits of her own story. Not everything, just enough to let Jenny know she wasn't alone. By the time they filled her box with groceries, Jenny was asking about the night school program. The afternoon brought Jesse's familiar rumble to the parking lot. He still rode his motorcycle most days, though now it carried tools instead of trouble. Together they headed to his workshop, where 3 old dressers waited for restoration. "These'll bring good money for the ministry," Jesse said, showing her how to sand the rough spots. "People love furniture with a story of redemption." Mara smiled at the metaphor as she worked. The wood grain emerged slowly beneath her careful strokes, beautiful patterns hidden beneath years of neglect. They talked while they worked, about her classes, about the kids in his ministry, about Grace. "Remember that first motorcycle we fixed up?" she asked, reaching for the wood stain. Jesse laughed. "You were so scared of the power tools. Now look at you, running that sander like a pro." "Well, I had a good teacher." She paused, brush hovering over the wood. "You taught me a lot more than just fixing things, you know." His eyes grew serious. "God did the teaching, Mara. I just pointed the way." The workshop phone rang suddenly, its harsh buzz shattering their comfortable rhythm. Jesse answered, his expression changing as he listened. "Yes, she's here. I understand. We'll come right away." He hung up slowly, turning to Mara with gentle eyes. "That was Mercy General Hospital. Your father's been in a car accident. Drunk driving. It's serious." The sander slipped from Mara's hands, clattering against the workbench. 1,000 emotions crashed through her. Fear, anger, grief, confusion. Jesse stepped closer, steady as always. "You don't have to go," he said quietly. "But if you want to, I'll drive you." Mara closed her eyes, remembering all those nights of Rick's, drunken rages, all the cruel words, all the shame. But she also remembered something else, words from her Bible study about forgiveness being a gift you give yourself. "I need to go," she whispered. "Not for him, for me." Jesse nodded, understanding in his eyes. He grabbed his truck keys. The motorcycle wouldn't be appropriate for this trip. The drive to Mercy General seemed both too long and too short. Mara stared out the window, watching familiar streets blur past. "What do I say to him?" she asked finally. You don't have to say anything, Jessie replied. Just being there is enough. Sometimes grace looks like showing up, even when it's hard. The hospital rose before them, its windows gleaming in the setting sun. Jessie found a parking spot and turned off the engine, but neither of them moved. I'm scared, Mara admitted. I know. Jessie's voice was gentle. But you're not alone. Not anymore. They climbed down from the truck, walking toward the entrance. Each step felt heavy with memory and meaning. At the automatic doors, Mara stopped, her heart racing. Jessie's hand found hers, strong and steady. Together? He asked. Mara nodded, gripping his hand tightly as they stepped through the hospital doors. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mara and Jessie made their way through the maze-like corridors of Mercy General Hospital. The antiseptic smell made her stomach turn, bringing back memories of the times she'd hidden bruises from emergency room nurses. Room 312, the nurse at the desk had told them, but visiting hours end in 45 minutes. Each step down the stark white hallway felt heavier than the last. Mara's hands trembled slightly, and she wrapped her arms around herself, a habit from childhood she thought she'd broken. Jessie walked beside her, his usual motorcycle boots making soft squeaks against the polished floor. Do you want me to wait outside? He asked quietly when they reached room 312. Mara shook her head. Please stay, just maybe by the door? Jessie nodded, understanding as always. Taking a deep breath, Mara pushed open the heavy door. The sight that greeted her made her pause in the doorway. The mighty Rick Dalton, the man who had terrorized her childhood with his rage and cruel words, lay small and broken in the hospital bed. Tubes snaked from his arms and nose. A heart monitor beeped steadily beside him. His skin had a grayish tinge that made him look ancient, though she knew he was only 50 years old. The room felt too small, too close. The walls seemed to press in with memories of all the times he'd made her feel worthless. But something else stirred in her chest as she watched his labored breathing. Pity. This angry, broken man had spent his life running from his own pain, drowning it in whiskey and taking it out on her. A nurse slipped past them, checking Rick's vitals with practiced efficiency. He's been in and out of consciousness, she explained softly. The impact caused some internal bleeding, but we've got that under control. It's the alcohol level in his system that's concerning. His liver. She trailed off, but Mara understood. Years of drinking had taken their toll. Mara moved closer to the bed, her shoes making soft sounds against the linoleum floor. A chair sat empty beside him, its plastic surface reflecting the harsh overhead lights. She lowered herself into it, watching her father's face. The anger lines around his mouth seemed deeper in sleep, like valleys carved by years of bitterness. Rick's eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. For a moment he stared at the ceiling, confusion clouding his bloodshot eyes. Then his gaze found her face. Mara? His voice was raspy, barely above a whisper. That really you? She nodded, not trusting her voice yet. Rick's cracked lips moved, trying to form words, but she held up her hand. Don't, she said quietly. Just listen for a minute, okay? He fell silent, something like shame crossing his features. Mara took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. The past year had changed her in so many ways. She wasn't the same scared girl who'd climbed onto Jessie's motorcycle to escape. I want to tell you about this past year, she began. About what happened after I left. She glanced back at Jessie, who gave her an encouraging nod. I found something I never had before. Peace. Purpose. Faith. Rick's eyes widened slightly at the last word, but he remained silent. The church food bank where I volunteer. It's full of people who've been hurt, who feel worthless. Just like I did. Mara's voice grew stronger as she spoke. But God doesn't see us that way. He sees value in everyone, even in the broken parts we try to hide. Tears began to gather in Rick's eyes, but Mara continued. She told him about the night school classes, about helping Jessie restore old furniture, about the quiet moments reading her Bible and finding strength in its words. She described the transformation that had begun in her heart, how forgiveness had freed her from the prison of anger and shame. "I'm not that scared little girl anymore," she said softly. "The one you used to yell at about her weight, about being worthless. I know now that those words were really about you, about your pain, not mine." A tear rolled down Rick's cheek, disappearing into the oxygen tube under his nose. His hand, the one without the IV, moved slightly toward her. "My little girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything." Mara looked at his outstretched hand, weathered, calloused, shaking slightly. The hand that had once slammed doors and thrown bottles in drunken rage. Now it looked old and vulnerable, seeking connection. Slowly she reached out and took it in her own. His fingers were cold, but they gripped hers with surprising strength. No more words were spoken. None were needed. In the quiet beeping of the heart monitor, in the gentle pressure of their joined hands, forgiveness flowed like a healing stream. Mara felt it in her heart, not a forgetting, but a releasing, a choosing to let go of the bitter roots that had threatened to strangle her own growth. Jessie remained by the door, a silent guardian of this sacred moment. Outside the window, the Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of mercy, soft pinks and golds that seemed to whisper of new beginnings. In that sterile hospital room, surrounded by machines and monitors, father and daughter held onto each other's hands and let grace do its quiet work. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be redeemed. One touch, one tear, one whispered apology at a time. The days following Rick's confession took on a gentle rhythm. Each afternoon, Mara would arrive at the hospital, her canvas bag filled with books, magazines, and her worn Bible. The antiseptic smell no longer bothered her as much as she made her way down the familiar corridor to room 214. Nurse Evelyn Carter often greeted her with a warm smile, updating her on Rick's condition before she entered. "He's been asking for you," became a common phrase, spoken with understanding eyes that had seen many families walk the path of reconciliation. One particularly quiet afternoon, Mara sat beside Rick's bed, her Bible open to the Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read softly, her voice steady and clear. "I shall not want—" Rick lay still, his eyes closed but listening intently. The oxygen machine hummed quietly, marking time with each breath. When she finished reading, he opened his eyes and looked at her with a clarity that hadn't been there before. "Read another," he whispered hoarsely. "Please." She turned the pages carefully, finding Psalm 23. As she read about valleys of shadow and still waters, she noticed tears sliding down her father's cheeks. He didn't try to hide them anymore. Jessie would visit sometimes, his large frame filling the doorway before he'd step in quietly. He never stayed long, but his presence brought a peaceful strength to the room. He would stand at the foot of Rick's bed, head bowed in prayer, his deep voice barely above a whisper as he asked for healing, not just of the body, but of the soul. Rick, who had once sneered at any mention of faith, now closed his eyes during these prayers. His face would soften, the hard lines of anger giving way to something more vulnerable, more real. The nurses grew fond of Mara, admiring her gentle patience as she helped them adjust Rick's pillows or encouraged him to take small sips of water. She learned their names, their stories, treating them with the same kindness she'd found in her own journey of healing. One evening, as the Montana sun painted the hospital room in shades of amber and gold, Rick seemed more alert than usual. Mara had just finished helping him with his dinner, simple soup and crackers, when he reached for her hand. "You know something?" Wes said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "You turned into someone beautiful, Mara. Don't ever let anyone take that from you." The words caught her off guard, making her breath catch. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw no trace of the bitter man who had once filled their home with darkness. In his place was someone humbled, someone who had finally seen the light. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered, squeezing his hand gently. That night, as she walked out into the dusky evening, those words echoed in her heart like a blessing. The Montana sky stretched endless above her, painted in deep purples and fading golds, and she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The next morning, her phone rang early. It was Nurse Evelyn, her voice gentle but direct. "Honey, your father passed peacefully in his sleep. When I found him, he was holding something." When Mara arrived at the hospital, Evelyn handed her a small, worn photograph. It showed a much younger Mara, maybe 5 or 6 years old, sitting on a swing and laughing at the camera. The edges were creased and soft, as if it had been handled often. Standing in that quiet room, looking at her father's still form and the photograph he'd held in his final moments, Mara didn't feel the crushing grief she'd expected. Instead, she felt a deep, quiet certainty that her father had finally found what he'd been searching for all those years: grace, forgiveness, and peace. Jesse appeared in the doorway, his presence solid and reassuring. Without words, he stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Together they stood in silence, honoring the moment when a broken life found its final healing. Nurse Evelyn quietly arranged the sheets one last time, her experienced hands moving with reverence. "He was different these past weeks," she said softly. "Like someone who'd finally found their way home." Mara nodded, carefully tucking the photograph into her Bible. The morning sun streamed through the window, warming her face, and she knew that this wasn't an ending, but a completion. The final chapter of a story about redemption and the transforming power of love. The weeks following her father's passing moved like gentle waves, each day bringing Mara closer to a new shore. She found herself standing in front of an old brick building on Main Street, its faded facade holding both history and possibility. The inheritance from her father, combined with donations from church members and local businesses, had made this dream possible. "The Rising Place," she whispered, touching the weathered bricks. The name had come to her during prayer, a testament to how far she'd risen from her own dark places. Jesse pulled up on his motorcycle, tools rattling in his saddlebags. "Ready to start transforming this place?" he asked, his eyes crinkling with warmth. They worked side by side for weeks. Jesse's strong hands guided her through basic repairs, teaching her how to sand wooden floors and patch drywall. The community pitched in. Church members brought lunch, local teens helped paint, and even some of the girls from the shelter came to help arrange furniture. "See how the light hits this wall?" Jesse pointed out one afternoon, wiping paint from his hands. "Perfect spot for those scripture verses you picked out." Mara nodded, already envisioning the space. Each wall would tell a story of hope. She carefully framed Bible verses alongside thank you notes from people who'd found help at the shelter. The cafe area slowly took shape. Warm colors, comfortable chairs, and the aroma of fresh coffee filling the air. The kitchen became her pride and joy, She installed new equipment alongside the restored vintage pieces, creating a space where she could teach others how to cook healthy meals. A corner was dedicated to a small library filled with books about healing, faith, and starting over. "It's more than just a cafe," she explained to the local newspaper reporter who came to cover the story. "It's a place where people can find hope, learn new skills, and know they're not alone." The reporter, who had once witnessed her humiliation at the grocery store years ago, looked at her with new respect. "You've come so far," she said softly. Opening day arrived with golden Montana sunshine streaming through the freshly cleaned windows. Mara stood in her new kitchen, taking deep breaths to calm her nerves. The aroma of cinnamon rolls and coffee filled the air. People began arriving, first a trickle, then a steady stream. She recognized faces from her past, the grocery store cashier who had witnessed her shame, former teachers who had watched her struggle, neighbors who had whispered behind closed doors. But today, they came with smiles and open hearts. The mayor cut a ribbon at the entrance, saying a few words about community renewal. Church members brought dishes for the potluck celebration. Local business owners presented cards of congratulation. Jessie stood quietly in the background, watching with pride as Mara navigated the crowd with grace. She had bloomed into someone strong yet gentle, confident yet humble. When it came time for her to speak, Mara stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, "but I want to be clear, this isn't about me. Every good thing here, every moment of healing and hope, comes from God. He took a broken girl and showed her that pain can become purpose. The rising place isn't just my story. It's for anyone who needs a second chance." The crowd applauded, and many wiped away tears. As people moved through the space, admiring the verses on the walls and sharing stories over coffee, Mara felt a deep sense of completion. She had become exactly who she was meant to be, not despite her past, but because of how grace had transformed it. The evening sun painted long shadows across the rising place's wooden floors as Mara sat in her favorite corner, warming her hands around a cup of chamomile tea. The cafe held the lingering sense of coffee and fresh-baked cookies from the busy day. The bell above the door chimed softly. A teenage girl stepped inside, her shoulders hunched and eyes red from crying. She couldn't have been more than 15, reminding Mara so much of herself at that age. "We're closed," Mara started to say, but stopped when she saw the girl's trembling lip. "My daddy said I'm worthless," the girl whispered, her voice breaking on each word. Mara's heart clenched at the familiar pain in those words. Setting down her tea, she crossed the room and gently took the girl's cold hands in her own. "Then you've come to the right place," she said with a warm smile that reached her eyes. Outside, the distinctive rumble of Jessie's motorcycle cut through the evening quiet. Mara glanced out the window to see him wave goodbye before heading off into the dusky mountains, his silhouette growing smaller until the engine's echo faded into silence. Standing there in the fading light, Mara whispered a prayer of gratitude for every tear, every harsh word, every moment of pain that had led her to this place of healing. Her reflection caught her eye in the cafe's glass door, a strong, confident woman who radiated peace and purpose. Not the fat daughter her father once mocked, but the beautiful soul Jessie had always seen in her, long before she could see it herself. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.